Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today and welcome to the Harvard Kennedy School's Women in Public Policy Program Seminar Series. My name is Anisha Cindy. I'm the Director of Research and Programs at WAP, where our mission is to equip leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. And this seminar is one of the important ways in which we fulfill our mission. I just wanted to share some brief seminar logistics before we begin. If you have any tech-related questions or issues, feel free to post them in the chat or private message anyone with WAP in their name. We have a group of folks helping out today. Thank you all for being here. For the Q&A and the questions and answer portions, Professor Magee has kindly agreed to take questions throughout his presentation today. We'll ask you to raise your virtual hand, which is in the reactions tab of your Zoom platform, or feel free to post your question in the chat, which we will be monitoring. Before I hand things over to our co-director, Hannah Relly-Bowles, though we are in virtual space today, I wanted to offer a land acknowledgement to honor the local Indigenous communities on the campus that we work on. WAP and the Harvard Kennedy School are located on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded homeland of the Massachusetts people, the surviving descendants of the first people of Massachusetts and of the Neponset Band of the Massachusetts. We honor this tradition and work towards a gender equity agenda that addresses the needs of all women, including Indigenous women and Indigenous communities. Thank you all for being here, and I will pass it to Hannah Relly-Bowles.
Thank you very much, Anisha. Welcome all. It is wonderful to see again so many familiar faces and names and new faces and names. So thank you all for being here. And this is our final meeting of the semester, final meeting of our seminar series on women's leadership in context, gender, power, and identity dynamics. And so all semester we've been having this conversation about, what does the cutting edge research say about contextual factors that influence women's leadership advancement, including organizational structures and practices, intersectional identities, and power dynamics. And so power is the core of what we're going to be discussing today. We are so appreciative that for Joe Magee joining us. He is a professor of management and organizations at New York University's Stern School of Business, which is sharing with me that he's been chairing their management and organizations department, for which I'm sure they are very grateful. So we're lucky to steal him away from that, to have him here to give this talk. Professor Magee, Joe, is also affiliated with NYU's psychology department and their Wagner School of Public Service. So a significant focus of Joe's research relates to power, questions of power and status. And what he's going to share with us today is a integration of really important advances in the study of the psychological experience of power with important advances in the psychological study of gender dynamics. And so let me turn this over to you now, Joe. Thank you very much for leading us through this final seminar.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Anisha. It's a delight to be here. I'm in a somewhat unusual setup in a undisclosed location in Phoenix, Arizona. I do hail from New York, but I'm about to jump on a plane back from a Thanksgiving break. It's very interesting for me to revisit this paper. It was a paper I think it made it into press in February or March of this year. But I also think Hannah was, first of all, Hannah's a co-author on the paper. And I think it was sometime around 2010 or something when we first started discussing these ideas. We had many laughs about how long it can take from an idea to a paper, and this takes the cake for my publishing record in terms of the duration it took to get this off the ground. I think the reason it took a while to get off the ground is honestly, at one level, the findings aren't new. The ideas in the findings aren't new at all. And so I had some concern for a long time whether we had something to say with what we were up to. And on the other hand, for some people, it's kind of strangely controversial. Either controversial because even though the ideas aren't new, it's not settled. Different people have different ideas out there. but also the way that we were able to go about empirically getting at these ideas is just unusual. I don't know how else to describe it at this point. I think it would be called a metasynthesis. That's the kind of going term for it, but it's just not always clear to me. And it also ended up kind of each time we dug into an area, we ended up kind of doing more with the little area than we had planned. And so I think there's a lot to go through, but I'm going to kind of keep this at a relatively high level where we focus on the main empirical analysis that we're up to here and the main ideas that I want everyone to try to take away and to kind of, challenge me or challenge each other with in the conversation that we have. I look at this as mainly, let's see, an hour and 5 minutes left, and feel free to jump in with questions as I go. There probably will be some time at the end also for some, sort of broader questions. So I'm just going to start with this quote, and this reflects the first sort of concern that I presented to you, which was, did we have anything completely new to say here? So this is one of Cecilia Ridgway's quotes. Sex gender differences are not produced by any gender-based differences in personality or ability or anything that you might sort of call essential. They're caused by men's greater power and status in society as a whole. And, I think in some corners, particularly in academia, this is almost taken as given by a lot of scholars at this point. And yet I certainly have plenty of conversations from baseball fields to dinners in New York where it's clear that people outside of academia don't take this for granted. It sort of makes sense when you describe why, but it sort of doesn't seem like it's the whole story to everyone. And what I think that we're able to do, as I alluded to here, is at least look at data in a different way. Because it's a meta synthesis, all the data involved in this project are going to be data collected by at a prior point in time that were published in some form or another prior to this paper. I happen to have collected some of the original data myself years ago, but that's not they're not playing a starring role here. They're just part of a much bigger project. So we're trying to offer a novel empirical examination of whether power plays an explanatory role in sex gender differences. That's the goal. As I try to sort of roll this out, I'll describe a little bit the journey for how I got here in terms of working on this particular project. So in 2018, Derek Rucker, Adam Galinsky, and I, both of whom are on this paper that I'm presenting today, wrote a paper for Advances in Experimental Social Psychology where we were interested in one thing, which was when you look at stratification or inequality in society or in organizations, if you look at the basis for inequality, whether that's because of, some sort of formal power differences, whether that's because of sex, gender, social class, and so on, what are some basic patterns that you see across those different bases of stratification? And the ROAD for us is an acronym where, regardless of the basis of inequality or stratification, you see inequality in resources. That's the one that I would say you see written about the most in the media, and also, any scholar would acknowledge is a big deal. So differential resources, meaning access to and control over wealth, information, and lots of other stuff, to be honest, but just to kind of capture the crux. It also changes opportunities that people have. So access or opportunities, we chose the O so that we could have the ROAD acronym, but you could have used another A here for access, jobs, promotions, education, investment, services provided by government and otherwise. A for appraisals, you could also say E for evaluation if you needed to, evaluation of behavior, performance, and characteristics, just knowing that people at different levels of power, men and women, lower social class, upper social class, get evaluated differently, even if their behavior is identical, simply because of the demographic characteristics that they carry with them. And the D for us is deference, that captures something about interpersonal behavior in terms of whose voice is heard loudest, who tends to receive versus confer respect, and who maybe behaves most assertively versus submissively in interpersonal interaction. So the reason I bring this up is we're not going to come back to the road today. I mean, we're happy to come back to the road, but it would sort of not be the point of today's talk. But for me, this was really the first exploration where I was kind of zooming out from the work I had done before, looking at the behavioral consequences and cognitive consequences of having power over other people or someone having power over you, and thinking about, is power really unique, or does it kind of look like other things in the space of hierarchy, social hierarchy, and inequality? And the point of the paper was to sort of say there are a ton of important differences, but also there's these really important similarities. And so that led us to start thinking about, I mean, this isn't exactly sequential, but I think that paper informed the way I'd been thinking about this project that had been on, I don't even know if it was on the back burner. It was somewhere for a long time in the back of our minds, that today's talk is going to be about. And this is, of course, Hannah's playing a starring role here. This is the paper that is the title of today's talk. And it's published, just so you know, in a fairly new journal. It's kind of, like I said, an unusual paper. And so it makes sense to me that it was published in a new journal that's sort of finding its footing. Part of the PNAS world out there, which a lot of people pay attention to the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, but Nexus was a new inter or multidisciplinary journal. And this paper sort of had that feel of kind of exploring new ideas with new methods, integrating a lot of different ideas out there. At some level, the main thing that we're trying to do here in this paper is to try to think about when there's not a clear sex-linked biological explanation to account for a sex-gender difference that is observed in the world, what would be a useful explanation? And, you know, as the Cecilia Ridgway quote captures, there's really a lot of theorizing out there that power or status differences across the sexes or genders might account for these things. And so one maybe more provocative way to say it is, could you just say that chronic power differences between men and women might explain the following effects that we see sort of in the corporate world that you see in front of you right now? And so the approach we're going to take is, and I'll try to describe it. I find this paper, just so you know, I find it confusing to describe no matter what approach I take. And so if there's clarifying questions that come up, I really do want to hear them. I've tried about 4 different orders of how to sort of unroll things here. I think Hannah's tried a different version herself at one point in time. It's not always obvious to me what the ideal way is. But here's the core objective here is to take a set of known sex-gender differences in the literature and then take a bunch of known, even if the history of the research on it isn't as thick as the sex-gender research, known differences attributable to power. So experimental research on power, where we've manipulated power and brought subjects into the lab generally, manipulated power, given some subjects or participants high power and some low power, and see if there's a parallel or a consistency where high power people look a lot like men, low power people look a lot like women in the sex-gender research. The idea being there that men have disproportionate power in most societies relative to women, and so they ought to look similar if you're looking at the same outcome variables. I am not going to be able to show you a really tight empirical analysis. That is definitely not the goal here. But the spirit of the way we think about this project comes from this Mark Spencer paper, Experimental Causal Chain Reasoning. And you can see the chain that we're sort of laying out on the sort of model, very simple model on the bottom, where what we're essentially saying is that we've got sex-gender differences and we've got meta-analyses of these now, and that's why I describe them as known, that there's a lot of evidence showing these. Known is a bit of a leap, I realize that, but I just want to say there's a lot of data supporting these. And the idea is that power is almost a mediating mechanism. So it's nothing about being a man or a woman other than the strongest version of the claim, other than that they have different levels of power that they're bringing to bear. And so power is the mediating mechanism that produces these psychological and behavioral outcomes. we're not going to be able to draw empirically that link through any kind of like nice regression equations or anything like that. But this is the kind of model that I want you to have in your mind as I go through the different steps, and we'll kind of unpack each box as we go. So I've already used the word opportunity here. We had an opportunity as researchers, that the kind of interesting sort of artifact, if you will, of sort of like doing this project over almost 15 years, is that I think when we had the idea, the data didn't, this is the second project like this for me, the data didn't exist to answer the question I was interested in answering at the time. It was what unspooled over the next decade or so that gave us the kind of evidence base to start trying to address this. Again, it's in a fairly loose manner, but at least the data is there for us to start making claims. And so little did I know, so that what I was very aware of is that there had been a lot of experimental research on power. And you can see that on the right side graph here. Over roughly 15 to 20 years, there was, I think, something like a 7-fold increase in papers published using experimental methods, testing what high versus low power sort of does to people, if you will. On the left side is the part I really didn't know, but there was a huge explosion in meta-analyses of these sex-gender differences as well. So there had been, decades of research in psychology and related fields looking at sex-gender differences, but there was this real attempt to consolidate that knowledge in the aughts, from 2000 2020, let's just say. So that's like a 6-fold increase, I think. So it's just a kind of a huge rise in research. By the way, one of the things that I was curious about, do all research areas explode like this over that 20-year period? The answer is no. There are plenty of others, but it's not like sort of like this is just reflective of a kind of default of what happened in research over that 20-year period. There seemed to be a kind of acute, if you will, interest in these two areas. One other paper that the same core group that did the road inequality did, so this was first authored by Adam Galinsky, but also with Derek and myself, was just trying to do a sort of similar consolidation of the research, the experimental research on power. I should say experimental and non-experimental research on power. And this is kind of a model that came out of that. I just want to use this to highlight that we had figured out a way to classify the consequences of power. So we had these different categories: cognition, self-perception, social perception, resistance to influence on the right side. And on the left side, we had sort of looked at a bunch of different manipulations. And it was the first time I had really looked systematically at all the different manipulations used in the experimental work on power. And I guess what I would say is one of the kind of secondary things that I learned in doing this project was it was apparent to me that not all manipulations were as reliable or useful in understanding power from my perspective. And so the ones I've highlighted here, the structural manipulations of power, and then what we call experiential manipulations and even conceptual manipulations, are the ones we're going to draw on for the current project that I'm presenting today. And then these are the types of consequences that we're also going to use to look at in terms of the behavioral outcomes. But we end up classifying them differently. So I don't want us to get too anchored on this figure, but this was another sort of piece of the puzzle. As I wrote this paper, I sort of realized, okay, there's a way to kind of categorize this conceptual space, and that's going to be important if we're going to do a large kind of data undertaking. So, all right. It is impossible to think about the method without getting into some examples, so I'll try to do that shortly. Let me explain. So the paper has all of these almost impossible to see without a magnifying glass flow charts that really describe the different stages. So the first thing, and this is actually a potential limitation of the project I'll talk about at the end, is that we started with what are the effects of power that we know about today? And by that, we took a pretty minimal standard, which I'll just say, like, I'm super uncomfortable doing this. I don't really like to claim an effect is something that we know unless there's several papers on the idea. But because the experimental research on power is actually relatively new in the sort of history of science, at least, There's just not a ton of data out there. But what we wanted to do was to identify what are the findings out there in the power literature in a very systematic way. So the way we went about it was looking at the review that we had written, as well as a couple other reviews out there, and then kind of snowballing from there. So it turned out, even though these were supposedly comprehensive reviews in 2015 and 2017, they missed some papers, or they just didn't want to discuss those papers, including myself in the 2015. We just kind of avoided a few things that didn't fit neatly into the package. So there's extra papers out there that aren't accounted for by these review papers. And we sort of hunted those down and found 290 effects that are attributable to power based on the experimental method, where high and low power are manipulated, which is a lot. Like if we had done this in 2000, there wouldn't have been half that number even. And so that's on the left side of this diagram. On the right side is just sort of trying to describe, and I'll let you look at that for just a brief moment, but it's trying to say, look, not every effect that's published as an effect of power either holds water or holds up to scrutiny, or, very importantly, is a paper that we're going to be able to include in this particular project because we're going to be comparing these effects against sex-gender effects. We felt it was really important that any paper that only had male participants or only had female participants wouldn't provide a comparable evidence base to use. So we sort of threw those papers out. And we threw out a bunch of others. Any neuroimaging or psychophysiological study we threw out as well. It's a set of complicated reasons, but one is that those are potentially more believable, that those would be kind of evolutionary or biological bases rather than social bases as an explanation for their effects. So we tried to sort of, there's one of many funnels, let's just say, in this project, where we had a bigger corpus of data, and we kind of funneled it down into what we felt like were the trustworthy essentials for the task at hand. So that's on the power side. Again, the main thing we're going to do here is compare power effects to sex-gender effects. So now we go to the sex-gender literature, and the nice thing here is you have these big meta-analyses. The first one we stumbled across was by Archer, who's seems to have more of an evolutionary orientation, but a big catalog and also a nice supplement online with all kinds of kind of, not quite the raw data, but a little bit of sort of behind the scenes of what happened. And then since 2019 and even intervening years, there have been other meta-analyses that have been published. So we kind of did the same thing, except, let me just go back really quickly. On the power side, what we had to do was basically do the first, what we understand to be the first power meta-analysis that's published. So the story within the story here is that I think we have the first power meta-analysis. We knew someone else had been working on one, but we never saw it published. And so in doing this work, we needed to do that. Why did we need to do that? We had to take, let's say there were 5 papers that were studying competitiveness, the effect of power on competitiveness. We needed to come up with an effect size across those 5 papers in a meta-analytic fashion to have an effect size that we could then compare to the sex-gender literature. On the sex-gender side, the effect sizes were already published because other people were doing those meta-analyses. So we don't have that kind of contribution on the sex-gender side, thankfully, because everyone else had been doing it in the literature. So, and then on the right side of this flow chart, you see a similar thing where we kind of excluded a bunch of papers based on, I'll just call them reasonable criteria. We worked really long and hard on identifying these criteria. I think it's getting into the weeds a little bit too much to go through those today. Okay. Then the next thing is you've got the power effects, you've got the sex-gender effects. But of course, there wasn't some divine intervention that told the people who are doing research on power, I want you to study variables A through Z. And then the same divine intervention happened on the sex-gender side, where they said, there was an intervention that said, I want you to study variables A through Z. So we didn't have a tight matching of what had been studied in the power literature and what had been studied in the sex-gender literature. And yet we wanted to compare these literatures. What that suggested to us, I think fairly early on, is just figuring out how to do it was I'll just say the bane of my existence for about 2 years, I think, was we knew we were going to have to abstract up from the exact effects to find a set of constructs that were being studied in both literatures, even if they didn't use the exact same dependent measures. And that would allow us to compare across these literatures. So again, the problem we were facing was a lack of a one-to-one match between most of the power constructs and the sex-gender constructs. And so what we did was, I'm going to make this seem very simple. Again, it took us forever. And it was highly iterative, and we made some mistakes early and kind of had to go back to square one. But in the end, what we figured out was there were these kind of conceptual construct spaces, almost like a fuzzy set sort of thing, where different dependent measures would sort of fit into different categories loosely. And we came up with, after an iterative process, a set of these categories. And then we had 3 independent judges. I was one of them, just so you know. I was the third sort of tiebreaker judge, if you will. But they were field experts. These were not naive people to the field of social psychology or organizational behavior. These were people who had been trained in sort of understanding what these concepts were, because it was a research endeavor where we were taking lower level constructs and trying to abstract out of them some meaning. And these folks categorized 148 constructs into 11 more superordinate categories. You'll see here I'm calling these level 1 and level 2, and I'll describe what that means in a second. I mentioned this just because it was my first experience of using ChatGPT in a research setting. But one of the things we needed to do was to define the construct, the level 1 constructs, 148 of them, so that we didn't have different judges thinking about different things. So we tried to standardize the definition, and we used ChatGPT for that. And I validated this against research papers definitions, and it works really well for that. This was by far the biggest time saver I had in the entire project. I was really hesitant to do it because I didn't know at that time whether this stuff would be accepted by journal land, if you will. It saved us a ton of time, and I would say at the expense of zero quality. We kept all the integrity, I think. ChatGPT is not amazing for everything. It was good for this. And just to give you a sense of the agreement, 2 out of 3 judges agreed on 91% of the constructs in terms of where they fit into these 11 level 2 constructs. And again, I'll walk you through some examples now. So again, 149 effects at level 1, level 2, there's 11. And then there's also this thing called level 1. You can sort of ignore that for now, but it's going to be key to how I present the data. So one example would be the construct I already mentioned, competitiveness. So that turns out to fit under a higher order construct called dominance, at least according to 2 or 3 of the judges. And this is already starting to show you some data. This is how we present the data in the paper. Dominance is a category within which we have several constructs, including the competitiveness. And you can see on the sort of left side, the power differences and the effect size that comes out of the power literature. And sort of center to center right, you see the sex gender differences and the effect size. And just so you know, for any effect size I'm presenting for the sex gender side, if it's men are positive, women are on the negative side. And so you can see competitiveness is one of the very few constructs where you have an actual identical match across the 2 literatures. For many others, there's no match, but we see all of these constructs as part of the level 2 higher order construct dominance. And so we can look at, is the direction of the effects similar in the sex gender literature and the power literature for all the constructs that fall under the dominance heading. Another level 2 construct that we have is interpersonal sensitivity. Giving social support is a kind of prototypical example of a construct in that area. And you can see here's another one where we happen to have a 1-to-1 match, but in many other cases we don't. So you kind of have a cluster of constructs that we consider indicative of interpersonal sensitivity. Another one is positive self-views or positive views of the self. And lots of different types of self-esteem are out there. One that's been studied in both literatures, the sex gender literature and the power literature, is physical appearance self-esteem, self-esteem based on one's physical appearance. There happens to be a one-to-one match here as well. The fourth, an example of the fourth area that we're interested in relates to cognitive processes. And mental rotation is an example of this that fits under the higher order construct spatial ability or performance. So I happen to present to you, so don't be fooled. I happen to present to you 4 examples where there is an exact one-to-one match across the two literatures. There's only 36 constructs for which that's true out of 100 plus. So it's a rare event. I've happened to give you the kind of neatest ones to look at. And you can start to see the effect sizes. All right. The final thing then is, okay, now we've got this level of analysis, these 11 clusters of constructs that we're calling level 2 constructs that we can compare across the literatures. And now we want to look at, is the effect size significant on the power side? Is it significant on the sex gender side? And do they run in parallel such that high power individuals look like males or men? I can say men in this case because one of the exclusion criteria that we did was we took out adolescents and younger children as one of our exclusions. And do low power individuals look like women when you compare the two sides? So we've got this language of consistent. That's when high power looks like men and low power look like women. And then we've got opposite or inconsistent when they run contrary. So opposite meaning it is contrary to our hypothesis as well. Like to the extent that this is a hypothesis-driven paper, when it says opposite, it means it's going against our expectations. And then there's also, just so you know, of course, the possibility that there's no significant effect, that there is something published, but the meta-analysis, for example, reveals that that all kind of comes out in a wash, and there's not a significant effect one way or the other. So I said ignore this for now, but I want to get into this for a minute. We end up with these 4 even higher level concepts that we're going to just call categories, or level 1, categories: agency, communion, self-evaluation, and cognitive processes. So this concept space wasn't super important to us, although it works out fairly well because there's a ton of literature in social psychology and organizational behavior and sociology on the concepts of agency and communion across gender and gender stereotypes. But this is basically just a way to organize a huge swath of data so that it's digestible. And so I'm going to present to you the findings in this way, where we're going to look at the agency findings, we're going to look at the communion findings, the self-evaluation findings, and the cognitive process findings. So just try to define these things as we go. These things they're big concepts, so they can be defined any number of ways, but those definitions should all be at least consistent with each other. So agency is about striving to be independent, to control one's environment and assert the self. It's about being active, efficient, and assertive. We have 3 constructs at level 2 here that we're going to look at that we consider part of agency. We have dominance, which I've already shown you an example of. We've got goal approach and disinhibition, and we've got risk seeking. Just to preview the findings in this space, there's a 13-to-1 ratio of findings consistent with our expectations to findings that are not consistent with our expectations. And I'll just let you stare at this for a minute. I'll just add a couple words because I can get lost looking at these tables like into the wee hours of the morning. I don't want us to spend forever doing it, but the kind of the interestingness is in the details a little bit. So the final piece I just want to make sure you're aware of is on the very right side here. If you see green, that's a row where we've got consistency. If you see gray, that's the effect size wasn't big enough to detect whether there was consistency or inconsistency. And if you see red, that means there's a finding there's a comparison that's inconsistent or opposite of our expectations. And then on the very far right, you've got the totals, basically. The total green or consistent effects, the total red or inconsistent effects, and then the number of no effects. And the main thing is, as you'll see with a lot of this, what I present to you today, is there's a lot of green, a little bit of gray, and not very much red. And though, again, the empirical comparison is kind of loosey-goosey, it's just shocking looking across so many different types of variables, how little red there is, how much evidence there is that runs against what we'd expect. So this is for the second two level 2 constructs under agency. So goal approach and disinhibition you see on the left, and risk seeking about 2/3 of the way down. And you can see the variables that we included under those categories. Again, a whole lot of green. All right, so that's agency. And then we have for communion, what is communion? Striving for social connection and cooperation. It's about being helpful, understanding, empathic, and sociable. We have 3 constructs under this category. We've got interpersonal sensitivity, which I already mentioned. We've also got sociability and prejudice and dehumanization. Let's be honest with you, prejudice and dehumanization was probably the hardest one to sort of fit in this 4 category scheme. And of course, what we mean here is the opposite. So we would expect prejudice and dehumanization to be negatively related to communion. This is actually the where we get the strongest kind of effect, if you will, a 20-to-1 ratio of consistent to opposite effects. And these are the variables that were included there. So that's interpersonal sensitivity. And this is sociability and prejudice and dehumanization. The third category is self-evaluation, which is just assessment of one's ability and evaluation to one's own experiences. There's 2 key constructs here at the level that we're talking about here where we can do a comparison. One is positive self-views, and the other is well-being. Evidence isn't as overwhelming here. We could talk about like that, to be honest, like I kind of expected that. There's just so many other things that could be predicting one's well-being than the power or one's sex and gender, that I'm just not super surprised that there's kind of more messiness here, but we still find a 5-to-1 ratio of consistent effects. And these are those results. And then the fourth area is cognitive processes. Just it's kind of hard to define really, but it's including attention, perception, memory, reasoning, problem solving, decision making. The big constructs here are spatial ability or performance, creative performance, and abstract cognition. Again, slightly weaker preponderance of evidence here, but still 4-to-1 ratio of consistency to inconsistency. And these are the variables that we include there. Just a little bit, like I'll just tell you, I was actually shocked that the first thing is I didn't know the sex gender literature in all of social and cognitive psychology as well as at least I should now. I have a hard time retaining it all in this small brain. But I was shocked at how many documented sex gender differences there were in this space. And then I was pretty surprised that the analyses held up in this comparison that we were doing here to the power literature. So if you just combine those 4 categories, agency, communion, self-evaluation, and cognitive processes together, you end up with this 9-to-1 ratio of consistent to opposite effects. Kind of an overwhelming pattern of evidence consistent with what we expected if you were to compare high power to low power, high and low power to men and women in these 2, I don't know that you could call them parallel literatures. They do sometimes speak to each other, but they are kind of operating mostly different researchers, different labs. The motivation for the research is often quite different. And so then the question is sort of like, is that just some kind of accident? And we would we would venture to say unlikely that you would get this ratio, 9-to-1 ratio by accident. We don't really have a statistical standard to compare it to, what the kind of counterfactual would be here. But it seems just overwhelmingly compelling, whether you look at it as a ratio, a pie chart, or all the tables with all the details. It's just kind of overwhelming what the direction of the evidence is. We did a few additional things. One of them, I have to say, I just find it so complicated to bring up. It was something that sort of came out of the review process. It was wildly entertaining and exhausting to work on when we did it, but I don't think the punchline ends up being worth getting sort of stuck in the weeds on. So I just want to mention this one other one that came out of, I think, the review process and being pushed in a useful direction, which was, okay, it shouldn't just be that the direction of the effect's the same, but if power is sort of truly playing a role in producing these sex-gender effects, you would expect the magnitude of the effect size to be similar in the power literature and the sex-gender literature. Now, given what I know about how research is done and the various methods that are used out there, I thought it was asking a ton of the data to actually get a positive correlation here, because the way in which sex and gender studies are conducted are so different, really, than the way experimental research on power is done. But you do end up, of the 34 constructs where there is an exact match, again, most of the constructs there isn't an exact match, but for those that are, there are 34 or 35 of them. And you end up with a positive significant correlation coefficient. So the magnitude of the effect sizes does seem to be somewhat similar across the two literatures, not just the direction of the effects being, similarly positive or negative. So for us, the key thing, I always use the word striking because I was really struck by the level of the correspondence. I thought when we were looking at this earlier that we would be on really shaky ground, almost to the point where I abandoned the project. And instead, we kind of doubled down and just went deeper and more expansive on the comparison. And to this day, I'm still struck by the correspondence between these effects in these two different literatures. Again, the ideas have been out there for a long time: biosocial explanations, other types of social explanations, feminist explanations of sex-gender differences have all talked about power. Again, there are people I talk to, they're like, of course it's all about power. And then there are other people I talk to who are like, what are you talking about? So if we're trying to sort of convince the world with the work that we do that, based on the evidence, I feel like for some people I'm preaching to the choir, and for others I'm not, with the data that we brought to bear on this particular problem in this paper. The concern I think many of us have, if you start to move away from the data and a little bit more into sort of just social and political life, the concern we have is that people are essentialized because of their sex gender, that people think that they can predict one's behavior because of their sex gender. And it's certainly not my view of the world. And I think that this evidence adds credence to the notion that that's kind of a fool's errand to think of people in those essentialist terms, based on their sex and gender, just to be particular about what we're talking about here today. As I said earlier, I would return to this one. Our starting point is a limitation, which is, it's just a function of who I was. I was someone who was studying power. I started to get interested in, I wonder whether these effects that we find in the power literature also have a parallel set of findings in the sex gender literature. But really the way we frame the task at hand now is the sex gender literature reflecting power differences that are actually going on between the sexes and genders. And that's what's producing the effect. So a more logical starting point, given the way we frame ourselves in this paper, is to actually start with sex gender findings and then say, is there a power difference out there? And if not, let's go study that. Let's actually run an experiment where we manipulate power and see if we get parallel effects. So that's sort of what I say here at the bottom about in terms of future directions. I think one way to look at the data that we have here is look where there isn't a power effect that's or even a paper that's been written about it, and now maybe go out and study those quote unquote in the power literature, but with this paper in the back of your mind. And one of the reasons we say that is that we thought we were going to be able to run a kind of more sophisticated analysis here, where the gender of the participants in the power studies would have been reported, which often was not the case, sadly, partly because we were going back a couple decades when the standards for what got reported weren't as tight as they are today. But also, we would have expected an interaction between gender and power, such that when you put women in a high power position, you might expect the sort of known sex gender difference to be eliminated. And we just didn't have enough data to do that. Less than 5% of the experimental studies that we had reported a power by sex gender interaction. I guess what I'd say about that is I'm a little bit skeptical that there aren't more interactions out there. I think knowing, having worked in the power space for a long time, a lot of people were sort of crossing their fingers and praying that they wouldn't get interactions like that. And my guess is there was a little bit of bias in the experimental setups so that you wouldn't get those interactions because that complicated people's lives in terms of the stories that got told. So I still think there's a ton of work to do where we kind of like own the sex gender difference idea heading into the power research and collect adequate samples so you can test statistically adequately for the interactions, and being much more open to the idea that those interactions probably exist. And that's the conclusion of what I have for you today. And look forward to questions, comments. What I'm going to do is just sort of take us back to one of the tables because often people like to look at those, but I'm happy to jump around and entertain any questions or issues that people have. Carol Ann?
Thank you so much. Oh, good. Did you call on somebody?
Yeah, I did. Do you want me to, or do you want me to
Yeah,
leave
go.
that
I
to you?
mean, go. I welcome that. Did Caroline have her hand up? Oh, terrific.
Yeah, I did,
Great.
Hannah. Hi. Joe, Carol Amanashi, I'm the Global Head of Diversity at HSBC. So I come at this from a very practitioner point rather than an academic point. Thank you so much for sharing your work. I found it fascinating. I guess my question is, as a practitioner, how do I incorporate this into my practice? And so I'd love, if you're thinking about how this can be utilized in a huge corporate setting, it's still the case that many corporates are still chasing better representation of women in leadership / power roles. I think what you're coming up here with is fascinating and a big explainer to me about why that job still is so hard. But I'd love any insight you've got in terms of how you would want this work to be incorporated as practitioners.
Yeah, I think sort of sadly, like I started, I don't think that there's a new thing here, but I think it emphasizes the importance of having women in roles with power. Because if power is driving these effects, you'd expect there to continue to be observed sex gender differences that people will misattribute to essentialist reasons. And unless you change the actual power hierarchy within organizations, you won't start to see as rapid change as you might
Yeah.
in terms of the behaviors and then people's perceptions and understanding of where that behavior comes from. So, I mean, I would have argued that before writing this paper, right, is my point. And I just think there's even more evidence here to suggest that that's an important thing to do.
So what your work is really confirming for me is the sort of chicken and egg about how hard it is to get women at any great scale in those senior leadership positions because of the value that people place on women in terms of not seeing them necessarily as high power status candidates, and that actually comes through all of the people processes that go around appointing somebody, right through their career. That's kind of what I'm struggling with a bit with this. I mean, it's a good struggle, so
Yeah,
I welcome it, but
yeah,
it kind of
yeah.
makes me think, oh my God, you've just sort of defined literally how hard the fight is in a whole pile of tables for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think other people have probably defined the fight better than I have. You know, to be honest, it's been hard to get researchers to understand how to make sense of this work. So it's one where the extrapolation into practice is even harder than most of the other work I've done, which frankly isn't super easy all the time. So I do think it is a challenge. You're not the only one that's going to have that challenge looking at the data. I don't think the answer is throw all this data at people, table of meta-analyses, and have them understand it. It's just overwhelming, and it's not meant to be consumed in that way, right? So to me, one thing I would just add is that one of the exclusion criteria here that we took out were papers where the finding could be attributable to stereotypes. So when it was clear that there was a third party individual judging men or women's behavior, we know that stereotypes are laid onto that behavior. That's part of the road model, and many people before me said this better than we did in that model. That sort of just had a different point. But when you add the stereotypes onto it, so if there are behavioral differences between men and women, which is what all the right side of these tables is supposed to show, is that there are, independent of the stereotypes people hold, there are behavioral differences and cognitive differences. The stereotypes to me just make that whatever gap there is, difference there is, it's just exacerbated by the stereotypes. And we don't even have that in this analysis. So I think we're giving, people who are skeptical about stereotypes about men and women driving unfair disadvantage to women in organizations, we've given them as much of a chance as possible in a sense. The picture we're painting here is, I think, a minimalist picture that power has some responsibility for these differences. And then when you add stereotyping and true like a social dominance, if we will, like men in organizations having a vested interest in maintaining a position of authority, like it just gets bigger. That's I don't know. That's a little like a little off the cuff for me there. I think I'm comfortable saying all that, but
Thank
I
you.
think also just to build on your point earlier that like if you look at the list that you have here, where you're showing that, people who are less powerful are more likely to experience negative affect, more likely to experience anxiety, more likely to experience fear, like if you tack that on to any group that is in a chronically lower status than higher status position, right? You might say, oh, well, these people don't belong, like they look how like kind of fearful and anxious that person is. And, like, I think the key is I think what you're pushing people to do with this is to separate the situation from the person. And so not like, so when people start saying women are, is to sort of start looking at, well, why? And could power differences help to explain some of the things you're looking at rather than the sort of obvious gender sex? Does that sound right?
I think so. I mean, um, this is quite different from what I'm about to say is very different from what I think you're thinking and from what I generally think about. But I did have to reconcile for myself the fact that a lot of these meta-analyses showed some quite robust sex gender differences that I think, given, I don't know, my liberal political orientation, had wanted to discount. And I actually got in conversations while I was working on this paper where I felt like the arch conservative, if you will, in the conversation, because people were dismissing that any sex gender difference exists in the world. And I said, no, they do. And some of them you can explain by some other variable like power differences. It's nothing about, but others of them like that relate to size and strength, like they do seem to be true. Like you can't just, it came up a lot in youth sports, and a lot when the sort of trans debate was sort of starting. And I just found myself representing a side, I would say sometimes where I felt like I was finally being truer to the evidence while also maintaining a belief system that I held dear. and they didn't always mesh as neatly as I thought they had before. So there's a lot of data in here that's worth looking at yourself. I think the communication about it is, again, it's very messy unless you come up with a high level message away from it. And I've tried to articulate that.
I'd love to follow up on that point, but before we do, Beth, do you want to unmute to ask your question that you've put it here in the chat? You can just reply in the chat if you don't, or otherwise, I think Anisha will unmute you. Oh,
Hi.
great. Hey, Beth, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank you so much. I love the practitioner question earlier, and similarly, was just thinking of connecting the dots there, right? Like, so self-appraisal. A lot of corporations go through year-end annual reviews where there's an employee self-appraisal followed up by the manager's assessment. And so I was just curious, does your research suggest a different way to do that practice based on your findings around gender, sex, and power?
Yeah, I do think multiple points of appraisal are incredibly important. And so the idea of 360 reviews always made sense to me. And then, the more students I talk to that live in these systems, there's, all kinds of other problems with them, it seems like. And so to me, that is the way to get around issues that come up from appraisal and stereotypes, is to have multiple points where not everyone is in a position of power or authority over the target being evaluated. To me, I guess what I'd say is, though there's a lot more systems that take that seriously, there are still a shocking number of systems that don't, where people's sort of fate is decided by someone with power over them, where, I think the evidence suggests that they're going to have a tainted perspective, let's just say.
Can I follow up that I'd like to follow up on something you were talking about that I wonder if you went over too quickly, and that was you were talking about power as a moderator, like, so power manipulations as a moderator. I wonder if you could explain to people, one, what some of these power manipulations look like, because you are actually kind of front runners around what these power manipulations look like, and then you went very quickly over the idea. I think implicitly you said, because you think it would change women. And I'd love for you to just talk for a moment a little bit about, like, I actually agree with you that if you prime for power, the effect is more likely to occur for women than for men. But could you unpack that a little bit? Because I think theoretically it's relevant to the structure of the paper, and also might help people think again about why, for instance, you have a man and a woman in a managerial position, and they both put in self-evals, and the woman has a whole bunch of other, like, self-deprecating comments. I'm not really sure if the client is fully satisfied, but we've worked really hard on this, where someone else might say, I know that client loved me, And so why do you think, could you just talk just elaborate that a little bit more? Because it might help people think about it theoretically and how to apply it in practice.
Yeah, so the couple things. One is, you want me to describe a little bit about the manipulations of power that have been kind of common. Actually, let me and by the way, it scares me to death that trying to describe this stuff in neat terms isn't easy. So you end up saying things like that'll change women, which is kind of like a weird way to describe this for sure. So let me just go back to this. Okay, so on the left side here, remember, we've got three different types of manipulations, and I think they're kind of ordered in terms of the strength of the intervention on individual psychology. So sometimes in the lab, what we'll do is we'll bring two people in and say, okay, you're here to work on a task together today. One of you is the boss, one of you is the subordinate. The boss gets to determine how to allocate not only how the work is done, but also there's a $10 bonus that will be allocated between the two of you, and the boss chooses how much of that to take for themselves and how much to give to their subordinate. And then they, work for 15, 20 minutes on a task, and then they do that allocation at the end. So that's what we're calling a structural manipulation, because we think that is trying to represent life in a hierarchy in an organization as much as possible. It is even that, which is the most heavy-handed type of manipulation that we've done in the lab, is still a poor facsimile of actual life in an organization. That is, after I wouldn't have said that 25 years ago. I felt much more strongly that what we were doing captured the psychology of it. I think it captures some of the psychology and probably totally misses other aspects of it. And probably there are certain things where it completely inverts it, and we should probably understand that better. The second form, which is the subject, that the participant knows what they're doing, but they don't know the effect it's having on them psychologically. So there's it sort of straddles the line between explicit and implicit, is having them write about a time when they did have power, or in the other condition, having people write about a time when someone had power over them. So that's this episodic recall that you see under experiential, the heading experiential there. And the idea there is it's getting people in the mindset of having power or not having power. And that part of one of the interesting things about power in the world is that it changes you psychologically such that it lasts a little bit across time. So if you can prime people's brains to sort of be in that mindset, it starts to affect what they do, at least in the subsequent minutes. Do I think the next day it has that effect? Absolutely not. Like any prime like this, which is what we call it, would never last beyond minutes. And then the other type of prime is the one below that called conceptual priming. And that's, for example, having people fill out, kind of do a word scramble where there are words related to powers. You might have a word scramble where they're figuring out the words are power, authority, boss, subordinate. And then in the low power condition, you'd have them do, like low power, subordinate, submissive, words that are maybe connected in the conceptual space to being low power. And there's some research that primes people's mind to behave in a way that's consistent with either having high or low power. There aren't a ton of studies like that. And I think that that's probably a good thing. Even though I've done some of those studies myself, I find the structural manipulations in the experiential ones much better. So that's one thing. The way in which your question about sort of my comment that if we intentionally collected enough people across the broad range actually of sex, gender, and manipulated power with them, expect the power manipulation to have its greatest psychological effect on women. The idea there is, I think, consistent with some of the data we were just looking at, that a chronic, if society is basically a patriarchy where women have chronic low power on average, you would expect on average the experience of having power in an immediate situation to change them the most, to change their psychology in the immediate sense the most. I don't mean change them in any kind of medium or long run. I just mean within that study's time period, with which, if we're dealing with laboratory experiments, is minutes. And it would be nice to have field studies where we did this as well. Am I hopeful that we can manipulate power in the field in a long-lasting way, where people are randomly assigned? Not really. It strikes me as potentially unethical. So you might have to get away from random assignments. You're not dealing with a true experiment anymore, but you might assign people to different roles with different amounts of power for some short duration of time in the field. And I would expect you to see the most behavioral change in women because of being chronically low power on average. Now, if you also deliberately created a low power condition, I think you'd expect similar behavioral change amongst men because they're chronically, on average, in a higher power situation.
I mean, right. And so I just want to connect this. First, we actually had a presenter a few weeks back who is working at the local level in India and did a manipulation where she just manipulated who speaks first and whether that affirmed the leader, who was sometimes randomly assigned to be a woman, and that had this like significantly positive effect. But I think what's kind of compelling about your connection to the literature, and then you go back to practice, is to think about your idea of this like chronic exposure to cues, right? So if you're chronically exposed as a man from the dominant group to men being in charge, men being in authority positions, men speaking up, that's going to kind of reinforce this notion of a psychological experience of power on a regular basis, in a way that women, if they're in an environment where women tend to be more likely to be in staff, they're less staff roles, then in senior roles, they're less likely to speak. I mean, it's just sort of what are the cues that are occurring in the environment, and then what you're doing in the lab is kind of recreating snippets of what might be chronically lived experiences within corporate environments, which is also super interesting if you connect it back to your point about the size of effect sizes. So you're seeing similar effect sizes to just grabbing men and women, kind of on average across a whole bunch of situations and looking at what the effect sizes look like compared to those types of situations that you were describing, where you have people in a lab pretty focused on whether they're high or low power, and then seeing similar effect sizes. So it's really super, super interesting. I just want to highlight there's so many pieces that you covered. I just want to pull out a couple of spots. Can I ask? Go ahead.
I very much appreciate that.
When we were chatting before the seminar, you also talked about, geez, there's so much data in the supplement. I wish people could take advantage of it. And I'd love you to just talk about that. Like, what are ways that you would encourage people to, to use this going forward? And you mentioned it, you got into a little bit when you were talking about the what might be the future of power studies. But if you could elaborate that a little bit, I think that would be of great interest.
Yeah. So one thing is so this is just like 100+ page document that gets uploaded with the journal article, and most people never read it. And it's sort of just the state of the art about what happened. It's so difficult to publish research now because there's not only the article that everyone sees, but there's tends to be an incredible amount of work behind the scenes that gets relegated to these supplements. This was no exception for sure. In that supplement, I'd say there are two things, one of which I just completely skipped over today because I said it was too complicated to get into, so we probably won't be able to sort it out exactly. But one is that the power meta-analysis is right there. Like, so instead of having to go through these tables, it's just all the power studies. And it also explains in another table why we excluded any, study by study across paper after paper, why we excluded them. And in there is some information. So whether this is for practitioners, that's a different story, but at least for researchers who want to get a kind of quick and dirty on what is the state of the power literature, A, this does that. B, I want to know, it's amazing what gets currency and what sort of takes off in the literature. Sometimes it's based on almost a myth, right? There's some study that was high profile and people refer to it over and over, and it turns out not only is there only one study, but that one study didn't even find what people remember about it. And so I think we did a lot of that work in this of actually, for some of us, it was unlearning stuff we received wisdom, for the last 15 years that we've actually perpetuated. It's like, wow, that study is known for that? It turns out, no, not really, so there's a lot of that. And I just think we clean it, so that should have been a paper in and of itself for the power audience. You know what I mean? Because I think we had a lot to say, and it's totally buried in this thing. We spent a lot of time on it. The second thing that we did was there was part of what we call a discriminant validity analysis, which was, it's basically taking what I think is a little bit of a harebrained idea, but, it's I referred to it as an accident, right? That maybe these two literature show these same effects by accident. Well, I think it's really unlikely. But someone else sort of suggested, well, maybe any two variables or the sex gender literature compared to just any variable would show a kind of consistency across these outcomes. And so we ended up comparing the sex gender literature to the literature on personality and finding out that there's a huge literature with meta-analyses on all the big five personality variables and a bunch of outcomes, including extroversion, which is probably the one people know the best of all the big five, introvert, extrovert. And so there's a huge database in there of all the meta-analyses on extroversion. And what we find, just so you know, is extroverts are more agentic. So you find the same thing on agency. They tend to have more inflated views of themselves, so they have more positive self-views and better well-being. There isn't much difference on cognitive processes, thankfully. If there was a bunch of literature showing that extroverts were better at mental rotation, I wouldn't trust it, I'll just say that, because I don't see any theoretical connection between these two things. And then on communion, you get the exact opposite. So extroverts are both more agentic and more communal, instead of less communal, like the power literature. So there's kind of a bunch of interesting stuff on personality in in the appendix or the supplement as well.
And you
Yeah.
have found that women were, I think it's not that strong, but there's some evidence that women are higher in extroversion than men. Was that
Well,
part of what you're?
I think what it boils down to is these personality dimensions have or facets have subfacets. And I think extroversion is just a really important one when you're talking about agency and communion, which is that extroverts are they're more agentic and more they're seen as they tend to behave more warmly, which is connected to communality or communion, and they're also more assertive, which is the part we usually think most about with extroverts, but also this kind of friendliness, sociability part, right? So this is why extroversion is seen as, and there is, I hate to say it, given I'm not very much of an extrovert myself, a lot of evidence that it's a pretty good trait to have, because it's nice to be both agentic and communal. I think most people think, and it's hard to find the secret sauce to do that sometimes.
Can you talk a little bit about, I'm just laughing to myself. My strategy was to marry an extrovert and then
Yeah, same here, sort of. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the studies that you excluded on the gender side? Because I think that's also on the gender sex side, because I think that's also helpful theoretically to think about, like going back to your point about kind of the the whole, maybe some of the debate about trans and what's gender, what's sex, and power's a little bit yeah. Anyways, can you talk a little bit about this theoretically? What did you want to leave out that you didn't want to claim, that you didn't want to address as necessarily power associated?
So on this, well, so a little bit that is that on the power side, but
Yeah, talk about both sides, but I mean, and just if you want.
yeah, I'm trying to, because there's so much, I'm trying to highlight.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've only given you a
no, it's fine.
to do
So
this, yeah.
I think anything, so notice item G here, when the sample for a power study, if the sample was of romantic partners. Well, so evolutionary psychology comes out of predominantly seems like out of mating behavior, right? So if you want a domain where evolutionary explanations would at least stand a good chance of holding up, right? It would be around like intimacy and romantic partners. So we just wanted to take that out of the equation. And I think you were probably part of this internal debate on the author team, like how much do we cede ground to the evolutionary arguments? Well, I'm happy on sexual, that's the other one there, sexual behavior, romantic relationships. I kind of don't want to get into that. And by the way, no one's really studying that in the power literature. There's a little bit on romantic relationships because intimate relationships are, to a large extent, I think, a power dynamic. But we just kind of wanted to reduce the noise, if you will, in terms of how many competing explanations might be in play. On the sex gender side, we took out anything that was related to physical harm or sexual violence, because kind of the same thing there. It just seemed like, okay, if you want to come up with an evolutionary argument, I'm probably more comfortable entertaining that in this space when it's about physical harm. Oh, and by the way, no one's manipulating power and then looking at who gets beaten up in the lab, because that's unethical, right? So we don't have comparisons anyways, but I like more the theoretical reason for I'm a pragmatic person. I will make practical choices, but I like having a theoretical reason, and I think there were theoretical reasons to avoid some of this stuff. And the same thing with measures of sexuality there. I don't know. I'm a little bit hand waving on this, I realize, but that's the idea. Where basically where I felt threatened by the evolutionary explanation, it sort of asked the question, do we really need this to make the argument we need to? Because we're not trying to explain everything. We're trying to explain a lot. We're trying to help explain a lot, I think is a better way. But there's going to be some areas where we're just gonna have to kind of give up, because we're already dealing with, like I've called it, loosey-goosey data associations here to begin with.
No,
So
I
we
love
just tried
that.
to
Yeah,
tighten up the
thank
space
you.
as much as possible.
I think that's right. I mean, it's not trying to be an explanation of absolutely everything, but trying to look at the relationship of power within institutions and roles and contexts, and looking at how the psychological experience of power in a moment or chronically might help to explain some of these things that we tend to associate with gender as this kind of trait,
Yeah,
stable trait, but that might
right.
really have more to do with the context. So going back to our really helpful questions about how do we apply this, is maybe really thinking about what are the power dynamics in a situation that might explain things before we jump to gender-based explanations. Thank you so much, Joe. It's a really complicated study that I was so grateful to have been involved in. You were a really important leader in pulling this all together. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please join us next semester as well, with Iris Bonet is going to lead a series based on our new book, Making Work Fair. So thanks everybody.